Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. And our guest today is going to talk about how Trump's trade war hasn't just failed, it has backfired mightily on a global scale. China is de-dollarizing as it has been for many years now. BRICS is gaining momentum. And we also have Putin, Iran, and the BRICS countries making moves that the U.S. cannot stop, as Trump's tariffs, which now are ranging upwards of 245% for some Chinese imports, is causing a huge shift in global power. To discuss this is Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, it is really good to have you back on today.
Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure being here.
Of course, of course. Everybody hit the like button as you come on. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. But Ben, let's get started, because this trade war that Donald Trump has ignited in recent weeks has reached a climactic point where now China is telling Trump to stop whining, and the United States rulers to stop whining over imbalanced trade. And Trump has put in a memo that there are 245% tariffs in total on some imports, like Chinese electric vehicles, for example. But this has backfired in an intense way on the global economy, on the U.S.'s economy, and also on the U.S.'s geopolitical position worldwide. Talk about what is going on. How have these tariffs impacted all of these areas, wherever you want to start?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say that not only has Trump's tariffs blown back in the U.S. economy, but in many ways, he kind of already gave up on the trade war that he started against China. So let's briefly go through the timeline here, because it's kind of confusing. There are so many contradictions. Trump will say something, his officials will say something different. So on the 2nd of April, Trump declared tariffs on countries all around the world on so-called Liberation Day. He held up this big chart, and he claimed that his tariffs were reciprocal, which is not true. It's actually false. The tariffs were based on other countries' trade surplus with the U.S. trade deficit. So they were not based on the tariffs that other countries charged the U.S. This is why Trump put 50% tariffs on tiny countries like the African nation of Lesotho, and he put tariffs on this uninhabited island where there are only penguins. And he also threatened tariffs of 46% on Vietnam, which is a major trading partner of the U.S., a major producer of electronics and other goods. That was on the 2nd. And then what happened after that is Trump issued a pause on the 9th, a pause for 90 days. And this came after a variety of problems in the U.S., especially a crisis in the U.S. bond market, which really concerned the Trump administration, because if the yields on U.S. Treasury securities, which is U.S. government debt, bonds, bills, and notes, when the U.S. government borrows money, it sells those securities in auctions, and investors demand some kind of interest rate, some kind of yield, and the yield shot up at a time when the stock market was crashing, which is a sign of severe crisis in the U.S. economy. And Trump blinked. He got really scared. He was watching Fox News. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump, he regularly watches Fox News, and he saw Jamie Dimon, who's the billionaire CEO of JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest bank in the U.S. And Jamie Dimon warned that this would cause a severe recession or even a depression in the U.S. Trump got scared. He also is being pressured by many of the billionaires around him, like Elon Musk, and also Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and Bill Ackman, the billionaire hedge fund manager. They were all pressuring Trump. Bill Ackman, the billionaire hedge fund manager, asked for Trump to issue a 90-day pause, and that's exactly what he did. So we see that, Trump's real constituency are these billionaire oligarchs. And then what happened is so he issued a 90-day pause except for China. And every few days, Trump keeps boosting the tariffs on China to a cartoonish level, because once you get over a certain amount, it's just symbolic. I mean, once you have tariffs of like over 50, 70, 100%, most trade is going to decline.
Right. There's no trade.
Yeah, there are only a few very specific things that no other country can produce. But I mean, if we're talking about things like, toasters and refrigerators and furniture, many countries can produce that. But if you're talking about like very specific semiconductors or machine parts, like those kinds of things are very difficult to replace. So despite the very high tariffs, companies in the US will still have to import those from China. So Trump, to try to punish China, to look tough as part of this new Cold War, he keeps raising the tariffs on China every few days. Now they're at 245%, which is just, I mean, China actually, so Trump falsely claims that his tariffs are reciprocal. They're not reciprocal. Reciprocal would mean that China charges supposedly 43% tariffs on US goods. It's not true. China has a large trade surplus with the US because the US is deindustrialized and doesn't produce that much other than oil and gas and crappy Marvel movies and, guns. So China doesn't buy that much from the US. It buys soybeans, oil, and gas. So the US has a large trade deficit with China. So Trump claims that China has tariffs that are equivalent to the trade surplus that it has, which are not, it's not actually true. So then Trump put those tariffs on China, and then China actually responded with real reciprocal tariffs. So Trump's tariffs were unilateral. China responded with equal levels of tariffs. So then every time China did that, Trump added more tariffs and more tariffs. And then eventually the Chinese government released a statement saying, we're not going to increase the tariffs because at this point it's meaningless. I mean, they're just adding numbers, but it's not going to meaningfully change trade. So we're at this point where now tariffs are 245% on China. However, that was the first week. Something changed on the 11th, which didn't get a lot of attention because Trump quietly issued an executive order that made it clear that there were exceptions for the most important products that China exports to the US, which are cell phones, computers, semiconductors, and other electronics. Now, Trump claimed on his Twitter copy website, he claimed that there are no exceptions. He said the fake news media was misrepresenting it. If you go to the White House and you read the executive order, it says exceptions in the title. It says exceptions in the text. They were exceptions. What Trump said is, well, they're not completely exempt from tariffs, but instead of being charged 145% or 245% now, they're charged 20%. But still, that is a major step back, and it's an implicit acknowledgement of defeat. After 9 days of this trade war, Trump essentially acknowledged that it failed because the U.S. economy cannot go a week without these very important electronics products produced in China, including, again, think about how important cell phones are to the modern economy. We could not, the U.S. economy would crash, and most countries in the world would crash if overnight magically cell phones stop working. I mean, think about everything is built around this digital infrastructure. Computers, I mean, give me a break. The computer is probably the most important technology in the world today. And then semiconductors. Every computer, every phone, all these electronics products have lots of chips in them. They're very important for the modern economy. And China produces many of the world's legacy chips. That means that not the most advanced chips, but the chips that are used in most average products. So by putting this exemption for these Chinese electronics, which represent, overall electronics represent over 1/3 of China's exports to the US, and Trump has now exempted many of them. This is an acknowledgement that, the Trump administration claimed that supposedly they had so much leverage over China. As Trump's billionaire Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent claimed, he said, we have all the cards. China has a pair of twos. He said, we're going to win this economic game of poker. But Trump immediately surrendered 9 days after he started this trade war, because in reality, it's China that has the actual cards. What this has shown is that the Chinese economy is much stronger than many people in the US think. And the US is actually much more dependent economically on China than vice versa.
Yeah, and here is China. There has been just constant trolling of these tariffs on Chinese social media, as you mentioned to me earlier this week, Ben. But this has been ongoing. But yes, indeed, China is much stronger and is showing itself much stronger than I think what the Trump administration has completely underestimated with regard to China. And I wanted to ask you, Ben, uh, given this, early on in this tariff war, what we saw, or this trade war that the Trump administration is trying to impose on China, we saw China make several moves. China asked its state-owned banks to hold off or at least reduce dollar purchases. We also had China, and this is causing panic actually all across the Western mainstream media now, institute export bans on critical rare earth minerals that the Trump administration has been very obsessed about since he came into office, including these magnets, which are especially important for essentially anything that is electric or gas run vehicles, for example, cars, and then of course the military industrial complex. So talk about these moves in response, because there was the retaliation, quote unquote, that Trump is calling it, the reciprocal tariffs. And then there are these moves which have so many different effects and reasons for coming into being. Why did China make these moves?
Yeah, well, you mentioned some very important ones. I'll add another one. China has ordered the airliners, the airline companies,
Yes,
which are
completely
largely
forgot.
state-owned. It has ordered them to stop deliveries of Boeing
Yeah.
airliners, which is very important because China in 2015 made an ambitious plan. It's called the Made in China 2025 plan. And over the past decade, they had many areas of technologies where they wanted to catch up to the West, to the US specifically, and develop semiconductors and drones and artificial intelligence and all of this. And they met the goal in every single area, every sector except one, which was civilian airliners. They're still behind. Although China now, as of 2023, has been producing its own airliners, its own jets. However, they rely on parts from the United States and from some European countries. So in the civilian airliner industry, it's a duopoly. There are two main companies, which is Boeing, which has destroyed its reputation. It's being run by these finance bros with no engineering experience. They just want to maximize the stock price and get paid fat bonuses, while they've let safety fall to the wayside and stopped investing and laid off good unionized workers who were trained and hired contractors who are not well trained. So they've destroyed Boeing. The other major competitor is a European company called Airbus, and they're a duopoly. So now China, over years, has been trying to develop its own competitor, and this is going to kickstart China's drive to have a competitor to Boeing. And I guarantee you, in the next few years, China will have its own civilian airliners with its own domestically made parts. Maybe there will be some parts from Russia. Russia has some companies that make plane parts as well, but it's not going to have any Western parts. And this is so similar to what happened with semiconductors, because in Trump's first term in 2018, he started the trade war in 2000. Well, his first term was 2017, but in 2018, Trump started the trade war in China, and he put sanctions on Huawei and some other Chinese companies. And then when Biden came in, some people thought that he would do something different, but no, of course, he continued this bipartisan trade war and new Cold War against China. And then not only did Biden keep Trump's tariffs on China, he added more. And in particular, the Biden White House put export restrictions on China to try to prevent China from getting access to the most cutting edge semiconductors, these chips that would be needed for research on artificial intelligence, or so they thought. Now we've seen that China has already made enormous progress. Chinese companies like DeepSeek have surprised the world by releasing these models that, one, are just as good as the models being produced by the US major company OpenAI, which should be called closed AI because it's actually not open source. OpenAI is 49% owned by Microsoft. And it's the CEO of OpenAI is the billionaire oligarch Sam Altman, who was invited to the White House just a few hours after Trump's inauguration this January to announce this Stargate project with $500 billion of investment in USAI. And then a few days later, China's DeepSeek releases this model that is, one, not only as good at, or not only as good or potentially even better as than the models produced by OpenAI, but two, it's open source. anyone around the world can use this program for free. They can run it on their computer locally. So that's a game changer. So the US thought that by restricting advanced chips that China would not be able to catch up in AI, but China has already caught up and is making huge progress. So we talked about how China is going to be catching up soon in airliners. It's already caught up in AI, and China is developing its own domestic semiconductor industry. As I already said earlier, China is the world's leader in the production of what are known as legacy chips, not the most cutting edge, but the less high-tech chips that are in like every modern electronic product that we use. And China is already dominating that industry, and it's moving to catch up soon in the most cutting edge chips. Especially Huawei has been working with this Chinese partially state-owned company, which is called SMIC, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. And together they've been making very cutting edge chips, including 7 nanometer chips that were released in the Mate 60 Pro, the Huawei phone last year. So China's making a lot of progress in that area. And now with these Trump tariffs, it's going to further incentivize China to develop its own domestic capacities in airliners, in semiconductors, in artificial intelligence, and in other industries, because every few days they announce new restrictions. So the Trump administration just ordered NVIDIA, the major US chip designing company, which has a monopoly in many of these advanced chip designs. The Trump White House ordered them to stop shipping certain chips to China. So they keep expanding the dragnet, and they expect that China can't respond. But as you acknowledge, China has responded in several ways. So let's talk briefly about rare earth elements. This is also very important for modern technologies because the supply chains for cell phones, computers, even the military technology used by the US, these supply chains are very complex. The US has many military technologies, like famously the F-35 plane, that rely on lots of rare earths. Where do those rare earths come from? Well, China dominates the global supply chain for the processing, for the extraction and processing of rare earths. Now, the term rare earth can be kind of misleading. People think that it's very rare, as in there are not many rare earth elements, but there actually are. There's quite a bit of rare earth elements around the world, but they're often not located in very concentrated areas. They're often spread out. So you have to find concentrated areas. And when they are processed, it's very toxic. It's very difficult to do. And it takes a lot of skilled workers, and it takes a lot of this technology that the US has not invested in, because US capitalists prefer investing on Wall Street in financial speculation. They don't want to invest in mining rare earths, which is not profitable. It's risky, and they can get much more return on investment by buying up existing assets through private equity or simply investing in the stock market. I mean, so there's been a massive shortage of investment in the US. That's why the US is deindustrialized, because it's not very profitable to invest in manufacturing. Trump expects that putting tariffs on will magically reindustrialize the US, but these capitalists, they just want to make money. They're just following their own economic interests, and it's very difficult, very complex, and risky to make a factory, to train workers, to invest in all of this capital expenditure, all these machines and such. And then you might not even make a good product. It might not sell well. You have to compete against many other companies, and you might lose money. Whereas, if you invest in the stock market, you buy up existing assets through private equity, you asset strip, it's much easier to make money. So China has invested in these supply chains and dominates the production of rare earths and other critical minerals, which is why the US government is obsessed with trying to remove China from the supply chain, because from their perspective of these imperial planners in Washington, they're preparing for a war on China. Very clearly, the defense secretary that Trump appointed, this Christian fundamentalist extremist, Pete Hegseth, who wrote a book in 2020 titled American Crusade, and he says that we're in a holy war. That's the term he used on the first page of his book. He says the US is in a holy war against China and Islam. There are nearly 2 billion Muslims in the world, and against the international left, he says. So this is the guy who's running the the Pentagon. In his book, he said that he wants to overthrow the Communist Party of China. That's calling for overthrowing the Chinese government. So this guy is extremist. He just went to East Asia. He went to Japan and the Philippines. And while he was in Japan, Pete Hegseth said that they're turning Japan into a war-fighting base to prepare for a war on China. So everything the Trump administration and the Biden administration before that, this is bipartisan. In Washington, there is a bipartisan consensus of a new Cold War on China, and they're preparing for war on China. They have a big problem. They rely on China for producing everything, not only phones and computers and semiconductors, but also the critical minerals that are needed to make the weapons that the U.S. military needs for war on China. So this is why they're so obsessed with removing China from the supply chain, because they recognize that if and when there's a U.S. war on China, China can cut off those mineral exports to the U.S., and then the U.S. doesn't have the minerals it needs to make the weapons for war on China. So the U.S. Congress has a special committee on China, very anti-China committee, and they published a report detailing ideas for trying to create new supply chains. So this is why Trump is constantly talking about rare earths, or he sometimes calls them raw earths, but whatever. The point is that what all of this shows in the past few weeks is that the U.S. thinks that it's going to be so easy to bully China around, to remove China from supply chains, to decouple economically from China. The Trump administration's top officials, like Scott Bessent, the billionaire Treasury Secretary, or Howard Lutnick, the billionaire Commerce Secretary, they keep going on TV and saying, China is dependent on us. We have all the cards. It's going to be easy. They have no alternatives. They sell it to the U.S. market. And then China has shown literally in 1 week, China showed the U.S. that actually it's in a much stronger position. And the U.S. economy is actually much weaker than many people think. It is a house of cards.
Well, yeah. I mean, to everything you just said, Ben, the New York Times actually reported in this article about the rare earth export bans from China, which they admit is not just U.S. based. It's actually China's doing this kind of on a global level in response to all of this. But it's going to hit the United States very hard. They admitted that if the United States wants to do any of this on its own, it's going to have to start from scratch. And then it takes upwards of 29 years to build these kind of factories that are needed to extract rare earth minerals. That's the first thing you need to do. And that doesn't even get into how China is 90%, I believe, of the processing of these rare earth minerals for them to even be utilized for the purposes that they are for. And then, of course, you mentioned Scott Bessent. Here he is. He admitted, the Wall Street Journal reported that he and the Trump administration are literally using these tariffs to build up for war with China. Here's what he had to say recently to none other than the American Bankers Association.
Unfortunately, the biggest offender in the global trading system is China, and they're the only country who's escalated. And I can tell the rest of the world that I'm not sure whether it was the prime minister or the economic minister in Spain made some comments this morning. Oh, well, maybe we should align ourselves more with China. That would be cutting your own throat, because I can tell you that these Chinese exports that the US tariff wall is going to keep out, that China, for all of you who can remember that Disney movie of the brooms carrying the buckets of water, that is a Chinese business model. It never stops. They just keep producing and producing and dumping, and it's going somewhere. And I think, Rob, at the end of the day, that we can probably reach a deal with our allies, with the other countries that have been long-term. They've been good military allies, not perfect economic allies, and then we can approach China as a group.
And then we can approach China as a group, Ved. So again, he just literally admits that this whole tariff business is for approaching China, which means confronting China, war on China. Ben, your reaction first.
It's obvious that the Trump administration thought that they would threat these really high tariffs on China, and then China would, like many countries, would beg the U.S. to please stop. As Trump said in this Republican Party gala. He said, 75 countries came to me. They're kissing my ass. I mean, it's so arrogant. And other countries they have internet. They can see these clips and see how Trump's talking about them. So he expected that Trump would be like, please, please, sir, take down the tariffs. Please, we will do anything. But actually, China's the only country that, I mean, other countries have had dignity and have stood up for themselves. But China's the only country that actually said to the US, okay, we will respond with actual reciprocal tariffs. And that's why Scott Bessent is absurdly portraying China as the aggressor. It was not China that started this. It was Trump that started this by imposing it was first 63% tariffs on China, which is crazy. That would reduce the vast majority of trade between the US and China. So then China said, fine, if you're going to hit us with 63% tariffs, we're going to respond with reciprocal tariffs. And every time China responds, Trump hits it with more. I mean, it's so similar to the portrayal of Israel, right? Israel kills Palestinians, occupies them, imposes a siege on Gaza for 2 decades. And then when Palestinians fight back, when little kids throw rocks at the soldiers occupying their country illegally, then the Western corporate media says the Palestinians started it. And then Israel attacks more, and Israel says it's self-defense, even though Israel is the one that started it. I mean, this is the strategy of imperialists throughout history, of colonialists. They attack an indigenous people, and then the people fight back in self-defense. And then the colonialists say, we have to defend ourselves, and we are the ones who are actually on the good side. And then the indigenous people are supposedly the aggressors. This is exactly how the U.S. is treating China. The U.S. started this aggressive trade war against China. China responds proportionally, and then the U.S. keeps ratcheting it up. And so Scott Bessent says that he wants other countries to come with the U.S. together in a group in order to isolate China. This has been the U.S. strategy for years. What is the U.S. going to offer these countries, especially after the Trump administration has been isolating itself from Europe? I mean, honestly, I think this is good for Europe. I think Europe should pursue an independent foreign policy. The more that it has subordinated itself to the United States, the more it has hurt the European economy. You see, European economies are in stagnation. Several were in recession. They have also deindustrialized and financialized. This Atlanticist model of financializing the economy and integrating all of Europe into Wall Street and Silicon Valley has been bad for Europe. What are the European technology applications that they have? They're entirely dependent on the United States. They use US social media companies. They use Google. They use Amazon. Europe should become a more independent pole in this multipolar world. That's a good thing. But the Trump administration is pushing Europe away, but then they expect Europe to come with the US together in a group against China. I mean, but as Scott Bessent acknowledged, Spain is trying to play this role right now in Europe of trying to improve its relations with China. Now, I have little to no confidence in the leadership of Europe, especially these warmongering Atlanticists like Ursula von der Leyen. I don't think that she is going to really improve relations with China. But there are some people who are a little more independently minded, especially France has always had a little more kind of a nationalist foreign policy. And Macron, he sees himself as a kind of de Gaulle figure. He's not a de Gaulle, but he sometimes says we want to be more independent. We want strategic autonomy. We want to improve relations with China. So this is an opportunity for, at the very least, I don't expect the EU to become like allies with China. It's not going to happen, but to at least pursue a more independent foreign and economic policy, which would be good for Europe. So the Trump administration has this totally contradictory policy. They expect everyone to come together with them against China, while the U.S. is actually attacking these countries that have historically been U.S. allies and vassal states, which is why even South Korea and Japan, which remain militarily occupied by the U.S. and have been for decades, even they are having negotiations with China, trying to improve their relations with China. It also helps that China is the largest trading partner of Japan and South Korea. Now, as for Scott Bessent's talking point that Europe should be careful about trading with China because China, he made this comparison to that Disney movie, I guess it's Fantasia, and he says China keeps producing. I mean, this is ridiculous in many ways because the idea of trade is that one country cannot produce everything And well, China's basically a continent. I mean, China basically does produce everything because it has 1.4 billion people. But Spain, he mentioned Spain. Spain's not a very big country. Spain can't produce everything. So the idea is that Spain will trade and export things to China that China wants, and it'll buy things from China that it can't produce because it's a small country. It's not a continent like China or a subcontinent. So he says this is going to be bad for Spain and Europe, but no, not necessarily if they have trade relationships that are complementary. So China does produce, for instance, a lot of electric vehicles now, and Europe has actually put tariffs on electric vehicles after the US did the same, and they're negotiating for some kind of agreement, and China is opening up some factories to make electric vehicles in Europe. But for instance, in Germany, China is still really reliant on a lot of machines produced in Germany because Germany is a manufacturing superpower, or a manufacturing power, at least, not a superpower, but a major manufacturing power. And Germany, even though its car industry is in decline, it still makes a lot of mining equipment, a lot of electrical equipment, a lot of advanced machinery that very few countries, if any, can make. So this idea that, as Scott Bessent says, that China is just going to destroy all local industry. And no, I mean, that's not, in the case of the US, it was not China that was responsible for US deindustrialization. This is what Scott Bessent, who's a hedge fund billionaire from Wall Street, he wants us to believe that because it's people like him who are responsible for the deindustrialization of the US, because it was not profitable for the US capitalist class to continue to invest in local manufacturing. It was much more profitable to open hedge funds like Scott Bessent, who, by the way, where did he get his career start? He worked for George Soros,
yep.
the billionaire financier, who ironically is one of the main funders of the Democratic Party. And if you listen to the Republican Party's rhetoric, they see Soros as the Antichrist, as the big, the boogeyman. And even during his presidential campaign, Trump's campaign released materials portraying Biden as a Soros puppet. And here his Treasury Secretary is a Soros protege, hedge fund billionaire from Wall Street, who's blaming China for the deindustrialization of the US, when in fact it was Wall Street that is responsible for these very same problems that we're dealing with today. So once again, we can see how the US, not just Trump, Democrats do this as well. They love to scapegoat China and say everything's China's fault, but the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. A lot of countries are looking at China, especially right now, and they're pretty happy that someone is standing up to the bully. Because a lot of small countries, they can't stand up to the US because the US can destroy their economy like it tried to do to Iran, like it tried to do to Venezuela, to Cuba. These small or medium-sized countries, it's difficult for them to resist the power of the US empire, not only militarily, but economically, right? The US can put sanctions on them and block them from the SWIFT system and seize their foreign exchange reserves. But we've gotten to a point where there are some countries that are too big to sanction. Russia being an example with the Ukraine proxy war and the seizure of Russia's assets in 2022. And Biden claimed that they would turn the Russian ruble into rubble. That failed. The Russian economy is growing faster than any economy in Europe right now. Russia's reindustrializing. It's deepening its trade with Asia. That failed. And now they're trying to isolate China, which is the world's largest economy when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity. It has been for nearly a decade now. And a lot of countries are happy that at least someone is standing up to the US. China's been fighting back against this trade war. A lot of countries are afraid to do so. So Bessent thinks, like many US officials, they have this blinkered vision. They think everyone in the world sees the world like they do. But the US actually is the minority. I'm not saying everyone in the world loves China and they all want to hug President Xi. I mean, but they see China as a trading partner, as a country that has its own independent policy that can help build a multipolar world in which countries have options. I'm not saying that everyone's just going to ally with China against the US. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that as the world is more multipolar, countries can actually have choices. They don't have to obediently follow the US and do whatever Washington wants. They can sometimes ally with China, sometimes ally with the US. They can go back and forth with other countries. They can improve their relations with India. And this is the whole idea of the multipolar world we're in. And the more that the US lashes out and imposes sanctions and tariffs on countries and threatens countries, it actually motivates them to seek alternatives. So the US has been trying to isolate China, and especially has been trying to put a wedge between China and India and China and Vietnam, which are Vietnam and India are major growing economies that are going to be very important in the decades that come. They already are very important. So what we've seen in the past year is that now China has improved its relations with India because India can recognize that the US is run by maniacs and they can't be trusted. And also Vietnam, which always had okay relations with China, but they were trying to balance both sides. President Xi was just visiting Vietnam. They signed dozens of agreements deepening their partnership. So the more the US pushes, the more other countries seek alternatives.
Yeah, and Malaysia, the kingdom, they have a kingdom government. They came out very strong during Xi Jinping's visit as well, stating that they stand with China wholeheartedly in building this kind of community for a shared future for humankind. And what that essentially means is that they are going to build and broaden ties. The entire ASEAN is going to continue to build ties, deeper ties with China. This is part of the blowback. And you mentioned, Ben, that in this increasingly multipolar world, what the impact of this trade war is essentially is that while it seeks to isolate China, actually what it's doing is isolating the United States. And I wanted to talk to you about the impact on the multipolar world, because as all of this trade war hysteria, this like pushing the button, taking the finger off the button behavior by Donald Trump, you had many announcements being made from other aspects, other areas of the multipolar world in relation to China. You had Iran, for example, as well as Russian oil spiking in recent months, especially in the last month or so, in response to the economic turbulence of the Trump administration. And then you also had Vladimir Putin. He was at Bauman Moscow Technical University. And here is what he had to say. This was as the tariffs were being leveled on China, 84% and 125%, 245%. This is what he told students there. He said, "We have big plans with the People's Republic of China. They are interesting, good, and grandiose. And in general, with the BRICS countries as a whole, with India, South Africa, Brazil, this cooperation does not stop and cannot stop." So, Ben, talk about how, as the tariff and trade war on China escalated and took shape as exactly that, a trade war, an economic war on China, the Trump administration has been trying to address and navigate the entire multipolar world in an attempt to essentially isolate all of them. And these are pretty big messages coming out of Russia, Iran, that they aren't going to be bullied either. So what is the impact then of the United States' moves here with relation to China on the broader in the broader sense?
Yeah, well, what this shows is that Trump thought that when he came in, he would, one, end the war in Ukraine immediately. Obviously, that's not going as he thought because the U.S. doesn't have that much leverage there, just like it doesn't have much leverage over China. So he thought he would end the war in Ukraine and ally with Russia against China to isolate China. That's what he said in an interview with Tucker Carlson. Obviously, that's not working. President Putin has said very clearly that Russia's relations with China are very important and with BRICS in general. Trump claimed that he killed BRICS in a press conference in the White House. He said, "I threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS and every country gave in and they surrendered." And he said, "BRICS is dead." That's not true. In fact, BRICS has continued expanding. In January, BRICS officially announced that Indonesia has been admitted as a full member. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world after the US. It has a massive economy. It's very fast. It's growing fast. So Indonesia is now in BRICS. And then Nigeria, which is the largest country, the most populous country in Africa. Nigeria has become a partner of BRICS as of January this year, when Trump claimed that BRICS is dead, which again, it's not. So, and then Trump thought that after isolating China, breaking the China-Russia friendship, ending the war in Ukraine, that he would use these tariffs to isolate China and force China to come to the negotiating table to sign a big deal with the US that would benefit the US at the expense of China. Now, obviously, all of those policies have utterly failed, a complete abject failure. And once again, what this shows is that US officials, not just Trump and the Republicans, but many Democrats, they're living in the 1990s, or at least the early 2000s. They still think that this is a unipolar world where the US can just do whatever it wants and can bully other countries around, and that the US has all of the leverage and all of the power, and China has no alternative. Scott Bessent has said this repeatedly. He says they have no alternative to the US market, even though China now does more trade with ASEAN than it does with the US. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And China does more trade with the global South than it does with the global North and with the West. So, the global economy has shifted in some fundamental ways. The main difference is China. It's not just China. We've seen relative growth in India, which is pretty impressive, although not nearly at the level of China. We've seen especially a lot of very rapid growth in Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam, which is following the Chinese model, but also Indonesia, Malaysia. So there's a lot happening. And a lot of these countries, of course, are either in BRICS or around BRICS. And Russia recognizes that the economic winds are blowing from Asia, and that Asia represents the majority of the world population, and it represents the heart of the global economy and the fastest growing economies and major manufacturing powers. So Russia, Putin being a brilliant geostrategic analyst who understands the world understands global politics at a very profound level, he can see that it would make no sense for Russia to sabotage its relationship with its largest trading partner, China, to sabotage its relationship with the global South, and Russia, not just the Russian Federation, but going back to the Soviet Union, for a century, the former USSR and Moscow today has carefully cultivated a friendly relationship with the global South. During the first Cold War, the Soviet Union strongly supported anti-colonial national liberation movements, whereas the US was supporting all of the European colonial movements. The Soviet Union was giving them weapons to fight against the European colonialists, the global South in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union fell, Russia in the 1990s was partially colonized by the US. So the people of Russia know basically what it's like to be oppressed by a foreign power, to have your economy devastated, to have your country pillaged by these foreign oligarchs and local oligarchs, of course. But the US played a big role, sending over economists from Harvard and the University of Chicago to privatize everything, to sell everything off to foreign corporations. So, Russia has cultivated a close relationship with the global South. So again, Trump thinks that he can just bully all these countries and they will just do whatever the US wants. But actually, this is only incentivizing countries further to seek alternatives. And this has been a process, of course, going back a long time, but especially I want to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's not that well known why Belt and Road was declared. Now, anti-China pundits in the Western media absurdly claim that China's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as One Belt, One Road, they absurdly claim that this is part of a Chinese insidious scheme to create an empire to take over the world. That's ridiculous. That's not at all what's happening. What actually happened is that the US government has been preparing for years now for war on China, or at least a new Cold War. And this goes back actually even to the first Bush Jr. administration. And right before 9/11, the George W. Bush actually had very harsh anti-China rhetoric. And it looked like before 9/11, they were preparing for a kind of anti-China focused policy. He accused the Clinton administration of being too close to China. Of course, Clinton invited China to join the World Trade Organization, which officially happened in 2001. And a lot of the neoconservatives around Bush were uncomfortable with that. If you go back and read the original statements of the project for the new American century, PNOC, the Bush neocons. They were really anti-China. And they saw China after the fall of the Soviet Union. They saw China as the next target. And Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, he famously gave a speech in 1989 where he said, "I looked forward to the end of the Cold War, but it looks like a new Cold War is beginning. The US and the West are starting a new Cold War against the socialist countries and the global South." He said that in 1989. So let's not forget that in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was this idea that after the Soviet Union fell, China was the next target. But then, of course, there was 9/11, September 11th, 2001, and the US so-called war on terror, and the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the war in Syria. So the US empire was much more fixated on West Asia, and China had a little more time to continue to grow. But then when Obama came in 2009, he appointed the neoconservative hawk Hillary Clinton as the head of the State Department. And as Secretary of State, Clinton declared a pivot to Asia. And what they really meant is they want to focus resources, military resources, for a war on China, to surround China. They saw that China was growing very quickly. And in response to the US pivot to Asia, the Chinese leadership recognized that they needed to diversify their relationship. They were too dependent on the West, on their trade with the US. This was over a decade ago now. So President Xi Jinping became inside the party. He was elected the Secretary General, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China in late 2012, and then he became president of China in 2013. And right after he became president that year, he went to Kazakhstan and he announced the creation of a new Silk Road. And that eventually expanded. The new Silk Road became One Belt, One Road and the Belt and Road Initiative. And now over 100 countries all around the world, almost entirely in the global South, have joined the Belt and Road. And China has been building new infrastructure around the global South in order to prepare for the moment that we're in now. Because China could see where the direction of US foreign policy was going, and that the US was preparing to try to isolate China, preparing for war on China, and that China could no longer be so dependent on the United States as its largest trading partner. So by building the infrastructure that would be needed for global trade without the West, China was helping to build the infrastructure for a post-US world, for a multipolar world in which the global South plays a much more important role in the world economy, especially Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the three continents as they're known. And they've now become, overall together, they represent the majority of trade with China. And that trend is continuing. And Russia, because the US-led West refused to accept Russia on equal terms, to respect Russia's national interests, they only wanted to subordinate Russia. They wanted to carve up and break up Russia so it could never be powerful again. Because the US would not allow that, Russia recognized that its future lies in economic integration with Asia and in general with the global South, which now Russia calls the global majority because Russia's not geographically in the global South. So what's happening is Trump is now accelerating a process that has been happening for at least a decade, if not longer, but really planned by the Chinese leadership since at least 2013. They have been planning for this transition. And now Trump came in his first term, and the Chinese leadership was not yet totally prepared for the trade war and this attempt at decoupling and all of this. Now they are prepared. They're very prepared. And this idea that Trump had that maybe could have possibly been possible in his first term of trying to divide China and Russia, it didn't work in his first term. Henry Kissinger advocated for it, a reverse Kissinger. It didn't work, largely because of Russiagate, but also because it was in Russia's interest to continue to deepen its trade and political relations with China and BRICS. And now we're at the point of no return. It's very clear that the future is in the global South, which is the global majority, and BRICS is one of several platforms that I think represents this kind of new multipolar order that we've been moving toward for a long time, but we're now finally seeing tangible examples of that are growing.
Oh, for sure. I mean, in many ways, I know that there are a lot of people in China online who talk about Comrade Trump because of this kind of economic isolation attempt to cut China off from the world that Trump has accelerated to such a degree using tariffs, astoundingly, instead of sanctions, which have been usually a principal tool for the U.S. But using tariffs to do this has actually created a large amount of self-sufficiency in China's economy to a degree that now, as you said, with BRICS and multipolarity, it's a point of no return in that as well. And Ben, there's also these other examples too of how this has also impacted the most beleaguered of the multipolar world, especially the rising powers. So you mentioned Russia, but there's also Iran. When this whole nuclear threats over, the threats over its nuclear enrichment system were underway by the Trump administration, it was China and Russia that stepped in right away and essentially started the process of negotiations around it, independent of the United States. And then it was Donald Trump that came in and said, "Oh no, now we should negotiate. Now that's all I want is to negotiate," and that's what's happening. These indirect talks. So it's had this effect of both China's economy becoming more resilient, the other BRICS leaders and members becoming more resilient, and now they are far more assertive politically in their leadership in the world order. What have you made about this connection of the economic warfare waged by the United States? Not just Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is accelerating it, but this economic war kind of backfiring and boomeranging into a stronger multipolar world.
Yeah, well, I'll briefly talk about Iran. Iran is a really good example of one of these countries that have fought for decades and really suffered in the unipolar era. So another example, an honorable example, would be Cuba, right? I mean, the people of Cuba have bravely resisted U.S. imperialism and aggression against their country for decades. The U.S. has tried to suffocate the people of Cuba for more than 60 years with an illegal blockade. It's very similar in Iran. The people of Iran had a revolution in 1979. They overthrew a dictator, the Shah, who was propped up by the West. He was installed by the United States and the British in 1953 when the CIA and MI6 carried out a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, the reason they wanted to remove him is because he was an independent nationalist who nationalized the oil reserves of Iran, which angered Western oil corporations. They removed him. They put in the Shah. The people of Iran had what essentially was a kind of national liberation movement, like many countries in the global south in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They overthrew the Shah, had a revolution. The U.S. then, which was allied with Iraq, the U.S. encouraged Iraq to invade Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. The U.S. gave Iraq a lot of weapons, but then it also, in the Iran-Contra scandal, we know that the U.S. gave Iran some weapons to try to kill people on both sides. Henry Kissinger famously said that he wished both sides could lose. So 1 million people died. And then the U.S. put heavy sanctions on both Iran and Iraq. The U.S. invaded Iraq 2 times. Well, the Gulf War, and it was also in Kuwait, but they attacked Iraq, and then they invaded Iraq in 2003. They overthrew the Iraqi government. They overthrew the Libyan government. They eventually succeeded in overthrowing the Syrian government. Iran has always been the target of this very aggressive campaign by the U.S. to destroy its independent anti-colonial government. It's part of this same process that the Western colonial powers had, where in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, across the global south, there were anti-colonial movements, national liberation struggles that had new revolutionary governments that came to power. The Western powers did everything they could to try to remove those governments. They succeeded in some places, or they succeeded in putting puppets in power, and they have never succeeded in Iran, and they've continued trying. Another reason, of course, is because Iran has very large oil and gas reserves, which are state-owned. we talk a lot about the coup against Mossadegh in 1953 for nationalizing the oil. Well, still today in Iran, it's an Islamic government, but it's also a nationalist, anti-colonial government, and they have national control, public ownership of the natural resources and many parts of the economy. So the U.S. has been desperate to try to remove Iran. Of course, there's also the fact that Israel is an outpost for U.S. imperialism in this very strategic region. The U.S. and Israel have attacked all of the all of the communist movements, then all of the Arab nationalist movements, and now all of the Islamic nationalist movements like, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah in Yemen, and of course the Iranian Revolutionary Government. They have failed, and the Iranian government has been able to survive all of these attacks, and the Iranian economy has become relatively self-sufficient. I mean, there are many economic problems in Iran, inflation, shortages of certain goods, but Iran has developed some impressive local industries, some local manufacturing. Even they have a pretty decent Iranian pharmaceutical industry because it's so difficult to get imports. So they had no option but to become more self-sufficient. So in Venezuela, when the U.S. initiated, first under Obama, the sanctions and economic war against Venezuela, and then Trump came in his first term and massively expanded the sanctions on Venezuela into a full-on blockade, like the blockade on Cuba, to try to destroy the Venezuelan economy. Iran actually helped Venezuela a lot because it's been under sanctions so long. It found ways around sanctions, and it helped to develop. It actually developed its own local oil infrastructure, because in Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years, well before the birth of Hugo Chavez. So Venezuela's oil industry relied almost entirely on machinery, on infrastructure from U.S. and European companies. It didn't make its own machines that it needed to upkeep its oil industry. So when the U.S. put all these sanctions and this blockade in Venezuela, it couldn't import the machines and the capital goods that it needed to maintain its oil industry. But Iran helped out a lot. So the reason I'm talking about all of that history is because what it shows is that even at the peak of U.S. unipolarity, the U.S. empire was never able to control everything, right? Like there were always countries that were resisting. And then the U.S. had all of these regime change wars to remove all of the independent governments that were resisting U.S. imperialism. Libya, they did it in former Yugoslavia, Iraq, tried against Iran, tried against Cuba, Venezuela, all these independent governments. But again, China and also Russia, but especially China, these are countries that are simply too big to sanction. They're too powerful. Their economies are too large. And instead of destroying their economies, what U.S. sanctions and U.S. tariffs do is it only encourages them to create a new parallel system, to new systemic alternatives to the U.S. domination of the global financial system. Venezuela and Cuba tried that. They did that regionally within Latin America. And they created the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, for political integration of the Americas. They created the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, for an economic alliance to bring together the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean so they can trade with each other without using the dollar. They created their own currency, international unit of account, to increase trade between countries so they're not entirely reliant on trade with the U.S. But of course, when you're dealing with countries with 20 million, 10 million, 30 million people, it's very difficult to create a new system to challenge the global financial system that is almost entirely controlled by the US. China and Russia, BRICS, together, their combined forces, they are so large, they now represent all of the BRICS countries, which is not just the original 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but also now Iran, the UAE, Egypt, Indonesia, and there are many other countries that are partners. When you consider all of them together, they now represent 42% of world GDP, measured at purchasing power parity, and 55% of the world population. The US, through these aggressive attacks and tactics, have pushed these countries closer and closer together, despite their differences, despite the many political differences between China and India. they've been pushed closer and closer together because they want to create some kind of alternative, some kind of structures that will give them more opportunities in the world so they can pursue their own independent path of development. So the US can't just overthrow their government with a regime change through a military intervention or a color revolution if the US doesn't like their government. Those tactics are becoming less and less effective. And honestly, I think that the Trump administration's extremely aggressive tactics, I mean, of course, they're not new. I keep emphasizing that there's a bipartisan element to this. But what I do think Trump represents is an acceleration of that and an increasing desperation, a recognition in Washington that if they keep using the old tactics, which were very aggressive, but if they are not as aggressive as possible, they're going to lose their hegemony. They're losing it very quickly. So what Trump wants to do is he's going back to the 19th century style of imperialism, which is really just old school colonialism. You know, Democrats will often talk about human rights and democracy and all that. I mean, it's propaganda. They don't actually believe in that. It's a tool of soft power to justify their imperialist policies. But Trump has dispelled that. He says, no, we need the blunt fist of imperialism, of old school colonialism. The U.S. was going to colonize Greenland. It's going to colonize the Panama Canal. It's going to colonize Gaza. It may even colonize Canada. And the U.S. is going to force other countries to pay tribute. This is like 19th century style stuff. Trump's top economic advisor, Stephen Myron, gave a speech on the 7th of this month, April, in which he outlined some of the tactics that the Trump administration is pursuing, its goals in applying tariffs to countries around the world. And he said that other countries can pay, they can write checks to the U.S. Treasury if they want the U.S. to lift the tariffs. They can give us money. This is an extortion racket. This is mafia tactics. And this represents a recognition in Washington that they have to be as aggressive as possible to try to maintain their empire, because this is what happens with every empire when it's in decline. This is with the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, which culminated in the Third Reich and Hitler. They get to a point of desperation where they lash out, attack everyone, wage war on everyone. They end up isolating themselves and actually accelerating the process of creating alternatives. What scares me, and what I think our goal is as people who want peace and don't want the destruction of the world, is we have to prevent World War III. We have to prevent this desperation in Washington from becoming a nuclear war, because there are some maniacs in the US who would rather have a nuclear war than see the decline of US hegemony.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and I believe that while some took a sigh of relief when the Trump administration began talking to Russia, for example, or even just recently after all this belligerence, threats toward Iran, are going to bomb Iran, took a sigh of relief when these indirect talks occurred, it all stands to reason that the entirety of the U.S.'s foreign policy at this point is the building blocks of this World War III scenario, which has these big fronts to them. It's China is the big one, the biggest one. And you said it here on this show before. There's a certain section of the ruling elite that doesn't see Russia as a threat. That includes, of course, the current administration, Donald Trump's. But we still have the Ukraine conflict going on. We still have Russia and, of course, Iran and West Asia. It's all these big fronts that also, I think, cloud what you just mentioned, Latin America. And, of course, there's Africa, there's the rest of the global south, which might be smaller in terms of the scale of warfare. But in terms of their importance, they're all connected to this, because the U.S. wants to see Russia and China separate from Africa. They want to see Africa subordinate. But Latin America too, it's the backyard of the United States. But it all comes back for the so-called foreign policy thinkers, the think tanks, those who make policy. They're all going back to Russia, China, and even in some cases Iran. I wanted to ask you though, Ben, there's this incredible op-ed that relates to this trade war, and actually the big impact here with the rise of the multipolar world that you've talked about on this show many times, de-dollarization. And I don't know if you saw David Ignatius, the very much maligned now journalist of the Washington Post. He who has been dragged, rightfully so, for his apologia of the CIA, of torture, and the like. But he actually wrote what is just a shocking op-ed about de-dollarization. As Trump trade war continues, the dollar may be caught in the crossfire. And he even cites the data, which a lot of Western mainstream media won't do. It cites the data about how the dollar is actually reeling, and that actually the International Monetary Fund is showing that the world is actually lessening its dependence on the dollar. Ongoing gradual decline in the dollar share of allocated foreign reserves of central banks and governments. The International Monetary and International Monetary Fund reported they had accounted dollars for more than 70% of reserves in 2000, but now less than 60% last year. Central banks are transitioning to gold and other non-traditional currencies, quote unquote, like China's RMB. So, Ben, talk about how this trade war is fueling de-dollarization, because this has actually been a fear that Trump came in with. He came in with this idea that he's going to save the dollar. That was his goal. He said it to all of us. The dollar is not going to die on my watch, is essentially to paraphrase him. That's what he said. So how has actually this trade war and the entirety of U.S. foreign policy at this point actually done the opposite, including under Donald Trump?
This is a theme that we've seen repeatedly with not just the Trump administration, but the U.S. government in general. The more it attacks foreign countries, the more aggressive it is, the more it's actually accelerating the search for alternatives. We saw this with the seizure of Russia's assets. The U.S. and the EU seized hundreds of billions of dollars and euros worth of assets held by the foreign reserves held by the Russian central bank. They did this also to Iran and Venezuela, and that accelerated searches for alternatives to the US dollar. And now we have China, the world's largest economy when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity. And now the US is threatening to do something similar to China. So China has been seeking alternatives. This isn't actually new. It actually goes back to really the 2008-2009 financial crisis. If you look at until then, central banks around the world were holding more and more U.S. Treasury securities, that's U.S. government debt, and they were holding them in their reserves. And then with the financial crisis, they started reducing their holdings and holding other assets, including gold. And gold holdings by central banks have been rising ever since then. But in the case of China, since 2013, 2014, China's holdings of treasury securities as a percentage of its overall reserves have been falling. Part of that is related to the US quantitative easing policy, but also it's because in 2014, the US put sanctions on Russia, and China was concerned that it could potentially be next. And of course, China was right, because the US has been putting more sanctions and export restrictions and now tariffs on China. The US has been putting them on China. So in terms of what's happening now with Trump, this has been a relatively gradual process, really until 2022. So Trump was reducing it. China was reducing its holdings of US dollars and treasury securities. Russia was doing the same. But in 2022, when Russia's assets were seized, it massively accelerated the search for alternatives, not only within Russia and China, but within many global South countries, even longtime U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Their reserves their central banks are holding fewer and fewer U.S. assets and more gold. And in the case of BRICS countries in general, another major purchaser of gold is the Indian central bank. India, of course, has good relations with the U.S., but they're also concerned about this. Now, so in 2022, it accelerated further. So there are kind of a few moments here. 2008, 2009 crisis, 2014 sanctions on Russia, 2022 sanctions on Russia, and now Trump's tariffs and trade war. And this is only further accelerating the sale of U.S. assets. But in this case, it's not just treasuries, and it's not just foreign central banks. It's foreign investors, period, which honestly is really shocking, because Trump is a billionaire. He has 13 billionaires in his administration. His treasury is run by a billionaire hedge fund manager from Wall Street, Scott Bessent. His commerce secretary is another billionaire from Wall Street, Howard Lutnick. One of the top officials in his administration is Elon Musk, the world's richest billionaire oligarch. He and Trump invited the most powerful billionaire oligarchs in the world to his inauguration: Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook. And now Trump's trade war policies, at least temporarily, crashed the stock market. The S&P 500, the main stock market index, fell by over 20%. The NASDAQ, which is a more technology-focused index, fell by even more. Some of that's recovered, but it's been very volatile in the stock market. Every time Trump announced tariffs, the stock market falls. Then he announces a pause, then it goes back up, and it's been very choppy. So this has resulted in a lot of volatility. And then when Trump declared these massive tariffs in countries around the world, there was a revolt in the bond market. Trump's officials have made it very clear they really want to bring down the yields on U.S. Treasury securities, especially the 10-year note. So when the U.S. government runs a fiscal deficit, it sells bonds, bills, notes, and bonds in order to finance that deficit. And the U.S. government is very concerned about the 10-year yield in particular, because many other rates in the U.S. economy are set based on the 10-year yield. So the mortgage rate, the 30-year mortgage rate in the U.S. is usually about 2% higher. There's a different spread. It changes over time, but it's, sometimes even higher, up to 3% higher than the 10-year Treasury yield. Right now, the 10-year Treasury yield was getting close to 5%, which means you have 30-year mortgage rates of 7 to 8%, which obviously makes it very hard for Americans to get a mortgage. It's very expensive. Furthermore, you have other loan rates like auto loans, credit card interest rates. They're closely related to the 10-year yield. That's part of it. But then also a major concern is that the U.S. government has, right now, it's paying out interest payments that are 3% of GDP. Now, MMT people correctly point out, modern monetary theory people correctly point out that a country that that can print its own currency can't go bankrupt in its own currency. However, I think they often downplay how much inflation can be caused because, the U.S., it's true, the U.S. can't go bankrupt from its own debt. Right now, U.S. debt is 120% of GDP. But the U.S. has a lot of inflation. A lot of that inflation is because the U.S. deindustrialized and can't produce anything. So it has to import everything from abroad. And the supply chain shocks due to the COVID pandemic caused significant inflation around the world, these disruptions. And now Trump is further disrupting supply chains, which is going to cause more inflation in the U.S., and he wants to reindustrialize, which is not going to happen. But if he actually tries to do that, it's also going to be inflationary. And he's deporting immigrants, which is also going to be deflationary. So all of these policies are deflationary, and the U.S. has this very high debt, which, yes, okay, it's true that the U.S. could basically just, metaphorically print money to pay off this debt, but it would run very hot inflation if it did that. And inflation is the main reason that Trump won the election, because a lot of voters blamed the Democrats for the inflation. I mean, the inflation was global, but most incumbents who were in power in 2022 during the inflation crisis caused by the pandemic disruptions, most incumbents lost power in elections. So inflation is a very important political issue for U.S. politicians, because if they don't contain inflation, they're going to lose the election. Trump knows that. That's really why he won. The Washington Post and Pew did studies that found that around 2/3 of voters in the U.S. said that the economy, and in particular inflation, was the most important issue in the 2024 election. So the Trump administration is in this situation where they do have this very high debt, which, yes, the U.S. government can't go bankrupt on its debt. But when they're running interest payments of 3% of GDP because the Fed raised interest rates, they're paying so much now. They're paying almost the same level on interest payments as they pay on the military. And the U.S. military budget is as large as the next 9 largest military spenders in the world combined. And now Trump says he wants to increase the military budget to $1 trillion a year. But Trump says he wants to reduce the deficit. So what's the best way to reduce the deficit? They want to bring down interest payments on debt. Well, in order to bring down interest payments on debt, they need to reduce interest rates. How do they reduce interest rates? Well, a few different ways. They could cause a recession. And some people have been speculating, and it's very possible that the Trump administration wants to orchestrate a recession because, they know that average working people will suffer. Millions of people could lose their jobs, but they can bring down interest rates, which means that the yields on 10-year Treasury securities would go down, which means that interest payments would go down and inflation would go down. Because in a recession, people lose their jobs. They don't have money. They don't go out to eat. They don't buy things. Those companies, those businesses lay off their workers. You have this spiral where inflation falls down because people don't have any money. So that's one possibility. And it looks like it's a very real possibility that the Trump administration may try to do that and then blame Biden. They'll say, well, this is the Biden economy. We couldn't do anything.
Especially if it happens early enough. Especially, I feel like the play has been if it happens early enough, then you can make that case if it's within the first 6 months or so. But continue. Sorry.
No, that's exactly right. They want to do it soon, certainly before the 2028 election, but also before the midterms, right? Which, U.S. elections happen every 2 years. It's crazy. I mean, it's just constantly keeping us trapped in this charade where we pretend like U.S. politicians represent people, and actually it's just a bunch of billionaires buying them off. But, in the case of Congress, over 80% of candidates running for the House of Representatives who have more funding win, and over 90% of candidates who have more campaign contributions win. So, it's the best so-called democracy that money can buy. But getting back to the bond market. So I've explained the problems that the U.S. has this conflict where, Japan, for instance, has debt of over 200% of GDP. But the reason that it hasn't been a problem is because inflation in Japan has been almost zero for 30 years, ever since the Plaza Accord, in which the U.S. overvalued the yen and crashed the Japanese economy because it caused this big Japanese asset price bubble that exploded. It popped in the early 90s, and there was a lost decade, and Japan has been stagnant and has had very low rates of growth, but also very low inflation. So the debt isn't a big issue. In the U.S., there were very low rates of inflation after the 2008-2009 crisis because, a lot of working people they had stagnant wages. And, when the economy is pretty stagnant, when wages are not growing, it's easy to have low levels of inflation. Also, China was exporting deflation to the U.S. in terms of low cost consumer goods. And now the U.S. with all these tariffs is going to have much more inflation because we no longer have the cheap goods from China. So the point I'm getting at with all these details is that the U.S. government is in this contradiction. The Trump administration, they want to bring down interest rates, but inflation is going to be a persistent problem. It's not just the 2022 supply chain shocks. It's here to stay. It's like the 1970s. So they need to find a way to deal with this. But usually, this gets back to the issue of de-dollarization. So I kind of went off on a trail there, but it's all related. The point I'm getting at is that the bond market is what the Trump administration is really concerned about. That's the main reason why Trump paused those tariffs for 90 days in many countries, because the bond market was revolting. And if Treasury yields get too high, it's going to cause a crisis in the U.S., like what happened with the British conservative prime minister. If you remember, Liz Truss was prime minister for 1 month, and then she introduced this budget that was this insane Thatcherism with huge deficits that were not financed by taxes or anything. The bond market revolted and she was ousted. So Trump was in a kind of similar Truss moment, right? And the reason I mention all of that is because it's important to understand this, because what it shows is the weakness, the Achilles heel of the U.S. economy. Because almost always when the stock market crashes, the bond market will rally, because investors will engage in what's known as a flight to safety, because their stock prices are going down. They sell their stocks and they want to put that money somewhere. So they panic. And what was seen as the safest investment was U.S. government debt, U.S. Treasury securities. So almost always in previous crises, when the stock market falls, bond yields fall because investors buy more bonds, and that means that the price of current bonds that have higher yields go up, and then as the yields go down, it makes it the borrowing cost of the US government lower. However, in this crisis that Trump started on the 2nd of April, we saw the opposite happen. The stock market crashed, and the bond market crashed. Bond yields went up, bond prices went down of existing bonds. That is a serious sign of a major problem, a structural problem. And I'm not saying it's going to cause another 2008 financial crisis, but it could cause a serious economic recession or some kind of crisis in the US economy, because what we're seeing is actually massive capital outflows. The US economy has been basically barely surviving in recent years after the 2008-2009 crash. It's been barely getting by through a big bubble, what people call the everything bubble. There's been a bubble in stocks, a bubble in real estate. There was until 2000, because of the COVID pandemic, until 2022 when the Fed raised interest rates, there was a major bull market in the bond market for years. And so now what we're seeing is that foreign investors are simply getting out of US assets. And that was really the only thing keeping the US economy going, is this big bubble in financial assets and the stock market and the real estate market. So what we've seen is that because of Trump's threats of tariffs and the volatility, a lot of investors simply don't trust US assets, period, because they say, okay, the stock market fell 5% yesterday, it'll go back up 2% today. It might fall 5% tomorrow. It might go up 5%. It's so volatile, they don't want to deal with it. They'd rather put their money somewhere else. So what we're actually seeing is that this is the real constituency of the US government. This is why the Trump administration is they have the fear of God in them now, because they don't really care about working people. Their real constituency are the billionaires on Wall Street and billionaires in other countries, the global capitalist class. And they're now doing a capital strike. They're saying that the US is no longer a reliable investment, and they're looking for the safest investments which they can find, which ironically is actually like Swiss bonds, German bonds. The European stock market has been rallying. So this was the only thing that the US economy really had going for it anymore was Wall Street, and then of course Silicon Valley. China is creating alternatives, competitors to Silicon Valley monopolies like DeepSeek. And now Wall Street is in crisis. So the reason I'm going so much into all these details is that what I'm trying to get at is that the US government thinks that it's so powerful and everything in the world revolves around the United States, and other countries have no alternatives to the dollar and no alternatives to Wall Street and no alternatives to US Treasury securities and no alternatives to big tech corporations in Silicon Valley. But increasingly, there are alternatives. And the more aggressive that Trump is, the more he's actually destroying all of the exorbitant privilege that the US had and all of these institutions that were keeping the US economy afloat and popping the bubble in Wall Street that made the economy look in the US like it was doing well, because as the Wall Street Journal recently reported, 1/3 of US GDP comes from the spending of the richest 10% of the population. The richest 10% of the population represents nearly half of spending in the economy. So if their wealth begins to decline because of these crises in the US capital markets, this is going to cause a cascading series of crises throughout the US economy. And that's going to further de-dollarization, because one of the reasons that so many foreign capitalists held their assets in the US capital markets is because they always assumed that the US dollar would be strong, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. They always assumed that the US government would always do whatever it takes to protect Wall Street, as what is known as the Fed put or the Trump put, which means that if there's a fall in the stock market, Trump will step in and save the stock market, or the Federal Reserve will step in and inject liquidity, reduce interest rates to save the stock market. But what we're now seeing is simply a flight out of US assets, which is why even Deutsche Bank, the major German bank, is warning that US assets in general are no longer seen as attractive to foreign investors. So if they continue this capital strike, the US is shooting itself in the foot on trade, shooting itself on the foot in terms of its exorbitant privilege with the dollar, and accelerating de-dollarization precisely at a time when Trump is telling countries that if they de-dollarize, he's going to put 100% tariffs on them. But now countries are saying, fine, we already have tariffs on us. We might as well de-dollarize.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's astounding to watch how, right now, Ben, there is this move by Donald Trump as he is escalating this trade war with China. One of the things he said, I don't know if you caught it, he has said that countries around the world are going to have to choose between the United States and China. And I wanted to actually pull this up because I think the Trump administration has not been told that the world has actually made a huge decision over the course of the last 25 years. Here you have in blue in 2000, where the US was the largest trading partner for these countries around the world, all of Latin America, most of Africa, most of Asia. And now you see the huge difference in 2024. But this is ultimately the move, it seems, Ben, that this push that China is making, that David Ignatius, the panic in his voice through his article on de-dollarization that he expressed, was that the world is getting sick of the weaponization of the dollar. And it seems like the Trump administration's attempt to push ultimatums to try to bully the world into a deal where it cuts itself off from China and the rest of the multipolar world is a big part of this. What exactly? Maybe you can explain this as we close here. Explain what exactly when Donald Trump, because this is what we have the privilege of with Donald Trump, is that unlike prior administrations like a Biden or someone else, Donald Trump says it straight up. He came in, said, we're going to revive the dollar. We're going to ensure that China and the rest of the, these BRICS, that they're not going to be able to do what they did in the last administration. But that means that there's something to fear. So what exactly are these countries doing? Why has there been this huge shift, not just toward China, but this multipolar world? And what exactly is the United States afraid of? Because you mentioned Wall Street and the corporations. They're all a part of this. They all share this fear. They're moving in this way in order to prevent the multipolar world from rising. But what's so scary about it?
Well, you lose the ability to extract monopoly rents from all around the world. I mean, this is the business model of the US, of big US corporations. You create a monopoly, and then everyone around the world has to pay you monopoly rents. I mean, it's like a landlord, right? This is what the economist Michael Hudson has been so brilliant at pointing out, is that a landlord doesn't produce anything. They own the land, and you have to pay them rent for the privilege to use it. And this is how many US big corporate monopolies operate, especially in Silicon Valley. This is their business model. In fact, Peter Thiel is the kind of power behind the throne of the Trump administration. He is this far-right billionaire oligarch from Silicon Valley. He wrote openly in an article that capitalism is more important than democracy. He does not believe in democracy, but he does deeply believe in capitalism. But when he says capitalism, he means monopoly. He wrote in an article in the Wall Street Journal titled "Competition is for Losers." That's the title. In that article, he said that capitalism is the opposite of competition, because he points out that if you have competition, eventually you have the rate of profit to fall. So essentially, he's acknowledging that Karl Marx was right, that when capitalists compete together, they push down profit margins. And if there's a perfectly competitive market, profit margins will eventually fall basically to zero. So Peter Thiel says that's bad because he's a capitalist. He's a billionaire. So he says we need monopolies. So he says that capitalism is not based on competition. It's based on monopolies. And he says monopolies are good. And he has a long article and he has a lecture you can find online explaining why monopolies are good and why Silicon Valley's business model is based on running at a loss, in destroying all your competitors, and then when you have a monopoly, charge monopoly rents, and suddenly you make a ton of profit. And if you look at many big tech corporations in Silicon Valley, this is exactly how they operated. Uber is an example, right? Uber comes in, it's running at a loss for many years. It tries to destroy all of the unionized taxi unions. Taxi workers in many cities like New York, they had strong protections, benefits, healthcare, retirement, because they were in a union. Uber comes in, it in some cases operates on an illegal basis or a semi-illegal basis in some cities. It destroys the unions because it undermines them by offering much cheaper taxis. So obviously, if you're an average person, you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're going to get an Uber. It's much cheaper. And then after they bankrupt the taxi unions and destroy their competitors and they establish monopoly, then Uber doubles their prices, which is what they did. And now they're very profitable. And this is true for many other social media companies. They operate services for free, they establish a monopoly, and then they start charging people money, or they fill everything with ads, or they limit your services and you can only use all of the full services if you pay them money. So this is what the US wants to do to the entire world. No competitors. Every country must be reliant on US big corporate monopolies. That's how you maximize your profits. And this is how you get billionaires, right? This is why when China just surprised the world with its extremely rapid development of electric vehicles, high quality, cheap electric vehicles, inexpensive, but very good. What was the response of Elon Musk? And this was even before he was in the government. This was back in the Biden administration. He said that if the US government doesn't impose significant protectionist policies and restrictions on Chinese EVs, we will go out of business. Tesla would go out of business. And after he made those remarks, a few months later, the Biden White House put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So, the Silicon Valley business model relies on no competitors. China is the major competitor. Go to Europe. What social media platforms do they use? US social media platforms do use. They use US social media platforms. They use Amazon. They use Google. They use Microsoft. They use Apple. These are all US companies. India is another example. India banned the BJP government of Modi, which has flirted with the US, but also kind of maintained an online position and now is improving relations with China. They went through, in particular, a very heated moment of anti-China hysteria in India. And they banned many of the most popular Chinese apps, like TikTok, which the US is trying to do now, right? What happened after India banned these Chinese apps? They went back to only using US apps. They don't have Indian social media platforms and Indian alternatives to Amazon. Amazon is very active all in India, and Amazon is undercutting local Indian producers by copying Indian products and selling it with the Amazon label. So this is what it's all about. It's about these US corporate monopolies being able to control the entire world, extract monopoly rents from everyone, and living like, trillionaires. That's their goal. They already have hundreds of billions. The goal is to have trillions. And China is the only country that actually has alternatives to all of this, which is why the US government is trying to ban them. The US government, in Trump's first term, they put sanctions and restrictions on Huawei. And then under Biden, they threatened to ban TikTok. They briefly banned TikTok. Now Trump's threatening to ban TikTok unless it's sold to a US company. And now they're talking about banning DeepSeek. The US military already banned DeepSeek. And OpenAI, which is 49% owned by Microsoft, its billionaire CEO, Sam Altman, he's calling for the US government to ban DeepSeek as well, claiming that it's linked to the Communist Party of China. And finally, this brings me to trade. So you show this very important map that shows that the majority of countries on Earth now trade more with China than with the United States. China is their largest trading partner. And why is that? It's because China produces everything, and these are high quality goods at very low prices, because the Chinese government carried out a concerted industrial policy. Every 5 years, the Communist Party releases a 5-year plan saying, these are the targets of the economy where the government is going to prioritize growth in these sectors. semiconductors, drones, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles. They released plans. They released a new energy vehicle plan. That's the term they use for electric vehicles, saying we're going to develop an electric vehicle industry and become a world power in automobiles. And they did so. They met their goals. In 2015, they made an industrial policy for Made in China 2025, saying we're going to provide investment in infrastructure, education, job training, cheap loans from state-owned banks, and other government support to develop these industries in strategic areas so we're no longer dependent on the US. And they've done so. So China shows that, yes, they have a socialist system with a market economy. It's a socialist market economy, as they call it. So it's not the Soviet Union. It's a different model, but they have the best elements of socialism with also combining market elements. So you do have competition, pushing for technological innovation. Their system is simply much more efficient, much more competitive, and much better than the US system, which is based on monopolies, charging monopoly rents, based on privatization of all of the public utilities, so they're expensive as possible. Infrastructure is falling apart because the government doesn't invest. Education is insanely expensive. Only rich people can afford good education. I mean, the Chinese system is simply much better at actually meeting the needs of its people and producing things to make people's lives better. The Chinese system is not good at inflating bubbles in the stock market. And they're currently popping the real estate bubble because, as President Xi said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. Whereas in the US, 10% of houses are owned by private equity and other investment funds. So, I mean, the Chinese system is simply a better system, and the US cannot accept that. And instead of learning from the Chinese system and trying to engage in an industrial policy, the Biden administration kind of tried a milquetoast, half-baked attempt at industrial policy with the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which now Trump is tearing up. And he expects that tariffs are going to magically reindustrialize everything. And that's all it takes, while cutting taxes on the rich, cutting taxes on corporations, reducing regulations. I mean, all they're doing is accelerating the deep structural crisis in the US. And, I'm an American, you're an American. I think that there's so much the US could learn from China instead of waging war on China. And if we were a little humble, we can say, well, yeah, we should actually do a lot of these industrial policy measures, public ownership of the banks, public ownership of all schools and education, and not just rich people can go to good universities, public ownership of infrastructure to build high-speed rail, public ownership of the electrical grid and telecommunications. There's a lot that the US could do, but it's run by an oligarchy. It's not a democratic system. It's a plutocratic system in which the rich buy politicians through campaign contributions, which we now know the Supreme Court in Citizens United said there's no limit, that corporations are people and they can donate as much money as they want to buy off politicians to do what they want. So until those problems are solved and there's a deep structural transformation of the United States, unfortunately, US politicians are just going to look for scapegoats. And their scapegoats, in the case of the Republicans, can be immigrants, LGBT people, whatever, wokeism, DEI. Or in the case of both parties, their scapegoats can be foreign countries, especially China. And they want to blame China for everything. The billionaires in the US who caused all of these problems, they want to blame China. But in reality, of course, in the US, we should be looking inward and see that it's the oligarchs themselves who are responsible. And China has benefited from the many bad policies that the US government carried out, but that's not China's fault. Every country is going to do what's in its interest. But unfortunately, the oligarchy of the US don't care about the vast majority of people. They only care about their own well-being. We see that now very clearly with Elon Musk, the world's richest man, like trying to run the US government like his own personal fiefdom. So I think that's a much bigger problem than anything China's doing. And the more, that we can stress that message, I think the better it is.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think you're exactly right. The way in which we have a system where when we talk about geopolitics, we're talking about finance, in the United States. We're really talking about finance capital. We're talking about finance and its complete intertwinement with the military, and how all of this is just so profitable. These monopolies are so profitable for such a tiny few number of people, and their system now has become anathema to real development. It doesn't happen in the United States anymore to an extent. We even had a super chat who asked, you know, if China doesn't make the most advanced chips for cell phones, who does? And you can definitely answer that question. But I think what's so interesting is that for wherever the United States holds on to any kind of technological superiority, which still does exist in some areas, uh, it is fast shedding its industrial capacity to the point where it has gotten to a place where a trade war, like tariffs in themselves, people criticize, say, Danny, why are you so against tariffs? And you've been on this show, man. You've said it's not the tariffs themselves. It's not if they're individual tariffs, if they're not blanket tariffs, and actually
if they're part of a larger
surrounded
industrial
by
policy,
exactly by a policy,
not just blanket tariffs on everyone in the world. It's crazy.
Then you can actually perhaps focus and plan development that will benefit your economy, the national economy. But of course, the United States has been operating for so long in the reverse. And as we have said, BRICS, the multipolar world, there really is no reverse button to that. We are seeing over and over again how the United States' economy has become so monopolized, so financialized, that there really is no reverse button, because Donald Trump hasn't uttered one plan. If it wants to stop de-dollarization, it hasn't uttered one plan for how it's going to ensure that rather than the dollar be just some weapon that's used to bludgeon other countries around the world, push them into a state of underdevelopment and indebtedness, how are you going to use the very system that the dollar is supposed to be backing to actually develop an economy that prospers not just the elites, but everybody in it, so that the United States once again, or at least, once it can become a country that's normal in the world, that is focused on its development, focused on uplifting the standards of living of people, rather than ensuring that the profits and the dividends and whatnot of shareholders are maximized as much as possible. That there hasn't been a plan to address that. And so all of this, let's stop de-dollarization, let's contain China, let's negotiate with Russia, let's threaten Iran, let's stop BRICS. All of this is about the United States simply going on in the same way as this economy and country that is dominated by an oligarchy, which sees its own preservation, reproduction, and any kind of expansion it can get of its dominance as the sole goal and purpose right now of the United States, and nothing else. But Ben, maybe you can answer that super chat question and any reaction you have to what I just said.
No, I agree with you. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, at the end of the day, all these issues are related. Domestic politics in the U.S. is obviously very closely linked to global politics, and the U.S. government is acting in the interests of these oligarchs on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley. And this is true for all U.S. governments. This is certainly true under Biden. Famously, Biden, when he campaigned for president in 2016, he said that 2020, Biden said that when he was at a campaign rally or a fundraising event, a gala with a bunch of rich people, he said that if I'm elected, nothing will fundamentally change. That was the famous quote. And he told a bunch of rich donors that. And he was right. When Biden was elected, nothing fundamentally changed. But in the case of Trump, I mean, he just made it as clear as day. You have to be blind to ignore the fact that Trump is constantly doing events at the White House with a bunch of billionaires, the richest people in the world, and Trump loves that. Again, at his inauguration, Trump invited the world's richest billionaires to sit with his cabinet members, including Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google. And then he invited more billionaires like Sam Cook. Sam Cook. I combined Tim Cook and Sam Altman. Sam Altman to the White House for this AI announcement. And then actually just a few days ago after Trump's tariffs briefly crashed the stock market, then it went back up. Trump, he went on his Twitter copy website and he tweeted out like, now is a good time to invest, like buy stocks. And then the stock market rallied because the US government is now openly doing pump and dump schemes. I mean, we talk about the US economy has become like a big house of cards based on a bunch of finance bros selling NFT schemes to each other and pump and dumping, meme coins. The US president has a meme coin. His wife, Melania, has a meme coin. And then now Trump himself is like pump and dumping the stock market with his Twitter copy website. But then after he did that, he invited Charles Schwab, the billionaire financier, to the White House. And Trump said, yeah, he made $2 billion in one day. What? This is insane. I mean, this is just blatant looting, blatant corruption. I mean, I often say that like what the US did to the former Soviet Union, to Russia in the 1990s with the looting of the country by oligarchs, that's what the US is doing to itself now in broad daylight. And I mean, it's incredible. But I could keep ranting, but I'll briefly now answer the question from your super chat. Great question. So if China doesn't make the most advanced chips, who does? Well, the answer is that mainland China doesn't make the most advanced chips, but a part of China does, which is Taiwan, which according to international law is recognized as a province of China. Even go to, for instance, the IMF website, which is dominated by the US. They have to acknowledge that it says Taiwan province of China. At the United Nations, they say Taiwan province of China. Well, Taiwan has the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer, which is called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And Trump is actually trying to force TSMC to move over to the US. It's actually bipartisan, again, like many of US imperial policies. The Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act, which was an attempt, again, a half-baked attempt at having an industrial policy in which the US government would provide incentives to develop local manufacturing of advanced chips in the US, largely because they're preparing for a war on the Chinese mainland. And the US knows that they're going to try to use Taiwan as this base to carry out a war against the Chinese mainland. So they're probably going to end up destroying Taiwan, the US. And they, just like the US destroyed Ukraine, and in an attempt to try to weaken Russia, as Biden's defense secretary Lloyd Austin said, the goal was to weaken Russia. They destroyed Ukraine and they didn't weaken Russia, but now they're going to try to destroy Taiwan to weaken the Chinese mainland. And so Trump has been forcing TSMC to continue to move its assets to the US. And what's funny is, the US government has been providing these incentives to TSMC, and they've made some factories in Arizona, but they've found a huge problem. It took them years to build all these factories and everything. And there were no skilled workers in the US who knew how to make semiconductors, because you can't just go from the street one day and you see a job listing and you go there and then you make semiconductors. It's extremely complicated, very skilled work. It's going to take a long time to train US workers on how to do this. So what happens is that TSMC, half of their employees are from Taiwan. They're just sending these employees from the factories in Taiwan with their families, and they're sending them to Arizona. And they're all like, they hate living in Arizona. I mean, it's a mess. But this is called a chip war. I mean, in the 21st century, this is one of the most important parts of the modern economy. Chips, semiconductors, computer chips, which are in everything. And China produces many of the legacy chips. The mainland of China produces the, not most high level, not the most advanced chips, but the most common chips. But then Taiwan province, it manufactures the most advanced chips. And then also ASML in the Netherlands is another major company involved in designing the machines used to make the chips. And then NVIDIA in the US is designing chips, but not actually manufacturing them. So once again, we see this global supply chain in many different parts of the world, and not even to mention all of the rare earths and the critical minerals and all of that are in the actual chips. And then all of the skilled workers. I mean, it's a very complex supply chain. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for the US to recreate that supply chain, which is why, this attempt at decoupling from China, I think it's either going to fail or it's going to take many years, if not decades.
Yeah, and with lots and lots of pain. I think maybe I can pull up one of these images, Ben, because Chinese social media has been doing a lot of trolling. Okay, and we can just end maybe on a fun note, so to speak, because of course there's been the Xi Jinping being told by Donald Trump, you need to call me to settle the trade, to settle this, to settle the trade disputes. The ball's in your court. You need to call me. We don't need to make a deal with you. You need to make a deal with us, which has, and I'm just trying to pull up all the examples of this that I have pulled up, because, it's just so funny to watch Trump actually having blinked, the United States having blinked. And here is what Chinese social media was posting, these I'm not going to play the music to them, but because of copyright, but these AI videos of essentially what the United States economy will become when the tariffs are supposed to supposedly reindustrialize the United States. So it's videos like this have been shared everywhere of just, the Trump administration making the sneakers now, making these so-called lower value added goods, returning them to the United States. And it's been hilarious. And then there's been so many on the front of just trolling. Here is one on the press secretary of the Trump administration wearing an outfit literally designed in China for a lot cheaper, actually. And China has been promoting their goods lately and how cheaper they are. I think there was one video saying that, there are these luxury bags you can get for 40,000 US dollars, for tens of thousands of US dollars. But if you actually just get it from the Chinese factory that's putting together all these parts and producing the bag, you're going to get them for 10, 20, 30 times cheaper.
And actually it's literally the same. The only difference is it doesn't say like Louis Vuitton or whatever. It doesn't have the little tag, but it's exactly the same.
It's exactly the same. And then I wanted to show the one of actually the military. Maybe I already have it pulled up. Yes, I do, actually. Here it is. So I think this is the Weibo account, actually. Yes, of the PLA saying, "Are you waiting for a long-awaited phone call?" Referencing Donald Trump continuously. I think he said this repeatedly over and over again, that Xi Jinping needs to call him, despite the fact that it's in the Trump administration laying all these tariffs on and essentially trying to bully China into taking just, this lying down. So all of this to say is that we are seeing, I think, Ben, and I think this kind of summarizes the stream. And I just want to thank everyone for giving all the super chats. I'll pull them up while I get Ben's final reaction. I think what we are seeing is that despite the growing pains, the difficulties that building a multipolar world, building an alternative to U.S. full spectrum dominance, despite the growing pains associated, we are actually seeing the United States through this trade war, but really through its entire foreign policy under Trump, before Trump. I think we've been seeing this for subsequent administrations over and over again. The more that it accelerates, as you said, this aggression on all fronts, whether it's military, economic warfare, what have you, it actually, what it does is, well, there may be a massive body count and just destruction laid in its wake, but what we see out of that comes a strengthening of relationships, of bonds, of new forms of cooperation, of de-dollarization, of moving toward world that is truly post-United States. And China is the most advanced economically. We are seeing this more and more so with countries like Russia militarily. And, it's only going to accelerate the more that the United States takes this absolutely destructive posture. But we're in an age where it can't really, unless there's a fundamental change in U.S. politics, unless there's a fundamental change in U.S. politics, there is no in U.S. economic development, its system. There is no other option that those who pull the strings of someone like Trump or someone like Biden or whoever, they don't see any other option, because if the other option is to cooperate, is to treat another country like an equal, is to allow an alternative economic development system to emerge alongside it, well, then that cuts into what their ultimate goal is, which is to topple the Chinese government, the economy, take it over, do what it does, which is nothing ever good. Just look at what's happened to Ukraine. And there's so many other examples to that. But that's ultimately the goal for China, for Russia, for Iran, for the rest, is to topple them means to extend this dominance. And it's not working in the way that I think many who see U.S. superiority and exceptionalism and all of this, and who still hold on to it, I think are having a hard time with this fact. The world is moving a different direction. The United States is moving in its current direction, in the other direction. And what they're hoping is to destroy. And I think you're right, Ben. I've been saying this. It's not about the chess game or the Brzezinski chessboard. No, it's about actually just trying to lay waste to all of the chess pieces in the way. It's not about outsmarting them. It's not about being better or competition anymore. It's about destroy, destroy, destroy. And that is winning. It's not working anymore. Your final thoughts as I pull up these super chats, though.
Yeah, it's about dominance, hegemony, and monopoly. Because again, that's how you maximize your profits in rent extraction. No, they don't want competition. They say there's a competition between the U.S. and China. We see that the U.S. doesn't want competition. China says, okay, fine, let's have a competition, because they know they'll win. The U.S. knows they would lose a fair competition. So it's tariffs, sanctions, restrictions, and war. That's their unfortunate solution.
Yes, indeed. Well,
What's your
thanks
favorite
everyone.
insect to eat? Some good comments.
Yeah, there's some good comments, some unhinged ones. If you want to give money to an independent media channel and you want to give unhinged comments, go right ahead. Just make sure you do it with money attached, because at the very least I can ignore it. And also you support independent media, unironically. In any event, all right, Ben, this was a great stream, everybody.
Yeah, that was a good comment. The U.S. wants to be number one, but its education secretary is a WWE wrestling executive, another oligarch. And by the way, I don't know if you saw this clip. It's so funny, of the U.S. education secretary giving a comment, giving a speech, and she talks about AI, but she doesn't know that AI, she says A1. I saw this clip that went viral on social media. I couldn't believe this. I thought it was a joke, but she was talking about how AI is changing education, and she kept saying A1 is going to change education so much. A1.
It's funny. It's really funny. Yeah.
I couldn't believe that. She doesn't know what AI is. This is the head of the U.S. Oh, here we go.
Let's see what she says.
I heard, I think it was a letter or a report that I heard this morning. I wish I could remember the source, but that there is a school system that's going to start making sure that first graders or even pre-Ks have A1 teaching, every year starting, that far down in the grades. And that's just that's a wonderful thing. Kids are sponges. They just absorb everything. And so it wasn't all that long ago that we're going to have internet in our schools. Woo. Now, okay, let's see A1 and how can that be helpful? How can it be helpful in one-on-one instruction?
A1,
That's Linda McMahon, the U.S. Education Secretary from a wealthy oligarch family. And by the way, Trump signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. So right at a time when she's calling AI A1 and warning about the effect of A1 in education. Well, we might not even have education in the US pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, Ben, it was great being here with you. Everybody, as you leave here, be sure hit the like button. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. Go to the video description. You can find all the places to support my work, Patreon, Substack, and so many other places. Thanks to everybody for Super Chat. Ben's YouTube channel, Geopolitical Economy Report, is in the video description as well. We'll be back again soon. I'll be back again soon in a couple of days. I'll announce what's going on. But without further ado, everybody, take care. Have a good night. Thank you again, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.